China, medieval China. China's history somewhat parallels the history of Western Europe in some important ways, but yet there are differences. When the Roman Empire fell, China fell also. When the Roman Empire was being beset by barbarians, China was also being beset by Mongolian barbarians. This we talked about in chapter 5. Whereas Western Europe crumbled and stayed crumbled, China crumbled for a while. And the era following the fall of the Han Dynasty is known as the era of 6 dynasties. During this period, the Mongolians largely took over northern China. And in fact, if you look on a modern map of China, this area here is called Inner Mongolia, because a lot of its people are Mongolian. Mongolians took over this part of China. The China itself was forced farther south, but they're up to anywhere from approximately 6 nations. It would vary from one generation to another, but 6 nations down here, all independent of each other and all fighting among themselves. This went on for a few hundred years, during which time there was no strong central government. Finally, the Sui dynasty, Sui, the book pronounces that Sui. The Sui dynasty unified China. I'm not going to write down the name of the man who did it, but just remember that China then had 4 dynasties that followed, not in rapid succession. These dynasties lasted a period of about 300 years apiece, so longer than most. But anyway, during the period we're talking about, medieval China, China was under 3 dynasties: the Sui, the Tang, and the I want to pronounce it Song, but that's not the way it's pronounced. Sun. Okay, Sun. All right. Again, it's not. Oops, I call it Song. It's actually Sun. Long O sound. All right. Now, here's what I remember about these dynasties. The only thing I care about, about the Sui dynasty was the Sui dynasty. It unified China, but it fell apart after a while. Then came the Tang dynasty. The Tang dynasty was perhaps the strongest dynasty China ever had. They conquered Tibet. They conquered and put Korea to tribute. They conquered Vietnam. And they kept the Mongolians at bay fairly well. They never conquered Japan, and in fact, Japan was never defeated until the United States defeated them in 1945. But Japan never was conquered by China. But these people were militarily strong. Now, under their rule, there was an attempt to help the poor by taking land from the rich and redistributing among the poor. And your book states that this worked for a time. But it actually resulted in more people becoming wealthier and seemed to work. But as is the case of every time in history where this has been tried, sooner or later became undermined. The poor, a lot of the poor wound up losing their land again. One father might be given a plot of land, and then within 2 or 3 generations, his children and grandchildren would lose it. And eventually, the stronger people, the richer people, would buy up the land, and it found its way into the hands of a few. And this tendency kept going on until finally the Chinese just abandoned the whole concept of taking land from the rich and redistributing among the poor. The rich found a way to buy land in such a way, with such an agreement, that even the government could not take it back. I mentioned the Tang dynasty was corrupt, and this led to a lot of the Chinese people eventually ignoring the dynasty. Hey, we can't deal with it. Villages began to govern and rule themselves. Then finally a group of people from Manchuria, I'm not sure, then finally a group of people came in and they destroyed the Tang dynasty. And for 2 generations, there was no strong central government until the Sung dynasty took over. Now, I must mention too that under the Tang dynasty, it wasn't just that they were militarily strong, but the Chinese always looked back to that dynasty as being the period of greatness. Poetry thrived, culture, music, the arts, all seemed to thrive really well during this dynasty. You know, it's unfortunate that it could not hold itself together indefinitely. All right, the Sung. The Sung dynasty was militarily weak. Now, folk, I have, since I started studying a little bit of Chinese history myself, compared the Sung dynasty to what I've called them socialist. They attempted to help the poor, which sounds like a noble thing to do. But what I've noticed in a lot about liberal socialism is they seem to deny that you must have a strong military. So basically they were militarily weak. Well, their neighbors sensed it. Tibet revolted, and the dynasty lost Tibet, not to get it back until the communists took over. Now, speaking of Tibet, there used to be a professor who parked in our parking lot out here who had a sign on his bumper, "Free Tibet." I don't know if he got a new car or if he's still here with it. I don't know who the professor was, but Tibet was reconquered by China when the communists took over. But anyway, Tibet revolted and got their independence. Korea revolted and they got their independence. Vietnam revolted and became independent. So all told, China's military suffered. But in the long run, to jump ahead of the story, the Mongolians eventually came in and they eventually conquered all of China. Now, during the time of the Sung dynasty, the Mongolians took over even more territory in the northern part of China and forced the Chinese here in the south, the Chinese to move south. All told, again, the army remained very weak, very ineffective, while the Chinese were attempting to help assist and help their poor. And the result was, by neglecting your army, Genghis Khan came in with an army maybe 10% the size of the Chinese army and conquered most of China. Like, Genghis Khan did not conquer all of China. Instead, when he took the northern part of China, he decided to head over here to the west and wreak havoc here in the Middle East. And then part of his detachment of his army went up and conquered Russia. Genghis Khan had a very, very large empire. But he died without finishing the job of conquering China. Instead, it was left to his descendants. The dynasty that took over, the Mongolian dynasty, was Yuan, the Yuan dynasty. They restored some prosperity to China, but also their most famous ruler was Kublai Khan. We remember Kublai Khan for 2 reasons. Number one, he tried to conquer Japan, so he sent a large fleet of ships over to Japan. And it introduces us to a word we're going to see later. A divine wind came up, which the Japanese called a kamikaze. Where do we run into that word kamikaze later? World War II. The Japanese suicide pilots were called kamikaze pilots. So we run into that word. Remember, kamikaze was divine wind. Now, it reminds me of something that happened in England. In fact, England is often compared to Japan because both England and Japan are islands off the coast of the mainland. But in the case of England, Spain invaded England, intending to take over England, and a big wind came up. And of course, the wind was of such a size it was devastating to the big, top-heavy Spanish galleons. And the English ships were hardly affected by it, but the English ships set 100 Spanish ships on fire while the Spanish were too busy trying to stay afloat, and they were to where they were unable to fight. In this case, though, the wind itself destroyed the Chinese fleet, and most of the Chinese fleet then never got to Japan, and what they did get there was forced to turn back. So Japan was never conquered. Well, the other reason, remember, Kublai Khan was, we Westerners remember, he was the emperor when Marco Polo visited from Italy. Marco Polo made the long trip to China, visited the court of Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was highly impressed with him. Kublai Khan made him an official in his government. And Kublai Khan supposedly traveled to various places in China. And when Kublai Khan returned after an absence of 20 years, he wrote a book about his travel. Christopher Columbus read the book and was so impressed, he said, I want to go to China myself. But Christopher Columbus had the idea that the way to get to China was to sail westward from Spain. The idea would have worked except for one thing. The Earth is 10,000 miles bigger than Columbus figured it out to be. And number two, Columbus did not know there were two huge continents between Spain and China. So Columbus, some people believed he died without realizing he never had gotten anywhere near the East Indies. But anyway, he had dreams of reaching China by sailing westward, influenced in part by Marco Polo's book. Now, under the Mongols or the Yuan, China prospered once again. These Mongolians seemed to appreciate Chinese customs and left them largely intact. Kublai Khan had been converted into the Buddhist faith and remained a Buddhist, which leads us to the next issue, the issue of the Chinese religious struggle that was going on at this time. Now, your book leaves the political history for a while to talk about the economic history and eventually the religious and philosophical history. One thing that I want to mention, something that I missed when I was in graduate school myself, and they say that as the years go by, the questions you miss on a test are the ones you're going to remember rather than the ones you got right. And one thing I missed was the question about the new men rising up from, you might say, poverty and becoming super, super wealthy. It did happen in China. You have what's called your nobility. The nobility are the ones who inherit the land and pass the titles on to their sons. But sometimes you have a gentry who come in, a landed gentry, who come in, born into poverty, and they wind up buying a whole lot of the land. Somehow maybe they have to be at the right place at the right time, or they're just more enterprising than others, or just for whatever reason, they are able to get a lot of the wealth. And the issue becomes, this is the issue a lot of societies had to deal with. Do these new people get to sit in government like the other nobility, or do the old nobility want to keep the new people out? And this creates conflict that has gone on all down through the centuries. Went on in Greece, went on in Europe, went on in Rome, and in China. Because a lot of times the old nobility is jealous of these and the rising new young entrepreneurs who become richer than the nobles are and become hated by the nobles. For most Chinese, their life centered around a village. You'd have a village here surrounded by the farmland, then a few miles down the pathway you'd have another village surrounded by more farmland. And the village oftentimes ran itself without being influenced or without being interfered with by the emperor. The emperor was too busy with making big decisions to worry about what went on in ordinary villages. The economy was mostly based on farming, and well, that's You might say, isn't that true of all these people, ancient, medieval? Largely so. However, what we in the 21st century and even in the 20th century, what we were looking for was what kind of trade and manufacturing did it have? Because again, what we know is without trade, without manufacturing, the society is always going to remain stagnant. Yes, you must have farmers, but the Chinese did start to become manufacturers and did start to trade. Now, in the area of manufacturing, I can't emphasize enough, until the 1500s, the Chinese were the most inventive, creative people on the face of the earth. I once saw a list of some of the things they invented, and folk, it's quite a long list. I mean, they invented, among other things, steel. And your book mentions how they set up steel mills. They learned how to get fire hot enough to melt iron, which is necessary to. Steel is made basically of iron and mixed with other metals, most notably magnesium, but also there are other metals that get involved. We have to have really hot furnaces. So the Chinese learned how to burn coal, and Marco Polo was impressed that there's a certain kind of black rock in China that burns better than wood. And the Europeans did not know how to burn coal, even though Europe had a lot of coal. And eventually they learned how to burn it. But the Chinese learned that coal burning produced a hotter fire than wood burning. In addition, the Chinese are credited with inventing silk. Now, but some of the more important inventions, the most important perhaps is a printing press. Folk with a printing press, they should have been able to get their ideas out cheaply and spread them out. And the printing press is necessary for any society that wants to develop complex technology. You may or may not realize that to put together something like an airplane, it requires reams and reams and reams and stacks and stacks and stacks of paperwork that if it had to be drawn up individually, and the paperwork has to change pretty regularly. I mean, at Lockheed, we'd ask our men every Wednesday and women to turn in their blueprints every week to get new ones. I mean, because there was often changes made in the old blueprints and it necessitated getting out new ones. But Thomas Edison, before he'd start trying to make an invention, he'd go to the library and check out every book he could find on what others ahead of him had done. And one invention would lead to another. In the case of Marconi, someone invented a spark gap, and Marconi went, hey, why didn't he finish it off? If he could send sparks into the airwaves, well, why didn't he send radio messages? So he'd use the spark gap to invent the radio. And then someone once invented a propeller, a little toy helicopter that had two propellers, one on top and one on the bottom. The Wright brothers were given this toy as a child, and from this toy, they eventually developed a propeller-driven airplane. Again, one invention leads to another. The Wright brothers, when they saw the toy, tried to figure out how it worked. The scientists of their day could not explain it. Today we have mathematical formulas, so we pretty well know why the thing worked, but in those days they didn't. Chinese also developed huge ships, 400 feet long or 450 foot long trading vessels. We're fairly certain they did, even though all we have left of them is their records, their stories, and we have one rudder, but the rudder is so big that it had to have been on a 450 foot long wooden vessel. How they made the vessel, they would take teak wood and bury it underground for several years. I mean, they put it like in a casket, cover it up with a covering so it would not rot. Then put the teak underground. When they brought the teak back up after being underground for several years, the teak would be really, really hard. And from this, they were able to build huge sailing vessels. It is known that their sailing ships went to Africa, but apparently did not go around Africa. But their ships went all around this part of the world you see here, and they went to California before Columbus. Now, you might wonder, why did they settle in California? One reason might have been, from here to California is 10,000 miles. In the case of the Europeans, when the Europeans crossed the Atlantic to the West Indies, they only had to make a journey of some 4,000 miles. The Chinese, it was about 2.5 times that. So the trip to California was admittedly long, and yet you can't help but wonder, where was their pioneering spirit? Why didn't they go in and conquer? Again, we don't know. They didn't seem to have what we might call a pioneering spirit. They invented, among other things, a wheelbarrow, gunpowder, the flamethrower. They used gunpowder to throw flames. And ironically, once they invented gunpowder, they taught its use to the Mongolians. Then the Mongolians came in and used that same gunpowder against them. They're credited with inventing paper. Now, something else they're credited with inventing. Very important. Paper money. Instead of gold and silver coins, they used paper money for a time. And they set up a banking system. Now, maybe I've talked to this past about what kind of chaos the world would be in without a banking system, but again, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and I often like to imagine, now what would it have been like if Lockheed would have paid its employees only in gold and silver coins, and only when they had the money. All right, here's what happened to me. At least 2 times I was at Lockheed. Lockheed went about 5 or 6 months without selling an airplane. One time they put a plane together and it had a lot of bugs in it that took some time to work out. And again, I can appreciate that because I dabble in radios, and most of the radio projects I put together don't work when I actually put them together. Eventually I can get them to work. Sometimes I've given up, but eventually they'll get to work. We have to debug them after you get them together. Well, they put together these airplanes, but supposing that Lockheed would go 6 months without paying its employees, then all of a sudden they sold 6 planes today. Now all your employees line up and they pay them in gold and silver coins. Well, the employees have to get big burlap sacks to put all the gold and silver coins in their sacks, and let's hope that we could all have gotten home without being robbed. Then once we've done that, we start paying off our bills, paying this and that, and trying to pay down our debts. And after a while, after a couple of days, all the money is gone because we built up a huge debt. Now, I mean, that kind of economy simply would not work. Employees who aren't paid for 5 or 6 months, number 1, they'll starve. Number 2, they'll lose their houses. Number 3, they'll quit. So what did Lockheed do? They had accounts with local banks. And they would simply borrow the money. Credit. Most of you will probably wind up borrowing money from time to time. And I want to say this about borrowing money. There are teachers going around saying how dumb it is to be in debt. But I've listened to experts. Supposing, all of a sudden a radio station, you have your eye on for years, a radio station you want to buy becomes available. The owner is willing to sell it for $100,000. You've saved up $200,000, but the owner wants to sell this radio station for $100,000. What should you do? Pull $100,000 out of your account and buy the station, or go borrow the money and buy it? You probably listen to experts. The experts say what you just said. The thing to do, you might have to pull $10,000 out to make a down payment, or so, $20,000 make a down payment. But the rest of it, if you have a choice between spending your money that day or spending somebody else's, spend the other person's money.
It's even better if you can borrow it and then you have a high yield portfolio. So like say the interest rate on the loan is like 3%, but you're making like 15%.
That's why you borrow. That's the reason you borrow. It's hope that you will make more money. Now, there are teachers going around who teach you that it's wrong to be in debt. But I want to tell you a little bit of a horror story about a young woman I knew when I was still single. Back in 1985, she was driving a junk car. I mean, nothing wrong with that. I've driven junk cars myself. She's driving a piece of junk. But she was saving money because she was determined, I'm not going to go in debt. She saved up $10,000, which in those days you could buy a car for $10,000, supposedly. Well, she got the dealership and, looked at the car she wanted. But the one she really wanted cost a little more than $10,000. She was able to eke up enough to pay for the car. Now, catch this close. But she could only afford liability insurance. So she had only liability coverage on a brand new car. Oh, huge mistake. Now, let me tell you something. If you have an old clunker that's 12 to 15 years old and paid for, and you don't want to pay the full coverage, go ahead and cut off the full coverage. Now, some of you looking down into your head like you know what I'm talking about. Go ahead and drive the old clunker with nothing more than liability. I've done it myself, but never on a new car. Never on a good car. Well, she had an accident, it was her fault. Her insurance company paid to fix the other person's car, and her car was a total loss. Supposing she had taken about $1,000 and made a down payment on a new car, and taken another $600 and put on insurance, and then taken the other $8,500 and invested in a mutual fund. Today, that mutual fund would be worth about $30,000 or $40,000, and her car would still have been paid off. Again, a horror story. But the Chinese, all right, what I'm getting at, folks, the Chinese set up a banking system and set up paper money. With this, they could have set up a society that could have burst out of its seams, could have overspread the globe, and maybe conquered the world. We might all be Confucian by now. They didn't. What happened? Along came a philosopher who said to the emperor, these ships are just leading to our people becoming greedy and immoral. Paper money leads to greed and inflation. I mean, there's James Madison, one of the presidents, believed that, by the way. We mustn't have this, and banks only lead to borrowing with interest or loaning out with interest. You must abolish the banks, you must destroy all paper money, and you must let your ships rot. The problem was their philosophers, which I'm going to get into in a minute. They're philosophers. I mean, a lot of people blame their emperors, but their philosophers, I mean, what they started to build, the philosophers came in and without meaning to, without God, the philosophers destroyed. Anyway, they had manufacturing, they had commerce. Their most famous trade route was the Silk Road. The Silk Road at this time rarely went all the way to Europe because trade with Europe had fallen off. Europeans no longer had any money by this time. But the Silk Road would take them to the Muslim world, and these Muslim nations still were blooming. But then travel over these these are the tallest mountains in the world. Travel around these mountains was dangerous. So again, the Chinese used their big ships and went and got to the Muslim world by way of their ships, which was safer and easier. And one ship, but these ships were huge. And one ship came back from Africa carrying a bunch of elephants and giraffes. And when the emperor saw the giraffes, he was highly impressed with them and wondered, why don't we have these here in China? But again, a philosopher came along and said these ships are making our people greedy and opening our people to different ways of life, and we have the best way and nobody else is as good as us. You must let the ships sink and rot. The idea, I mean, everybody does this, folks, but the Chinese had the idea that we're better than everybody else. And it proved to be their undoing. It meant they had nothing to learn from anybody, and including they had nothing to learn from the Europeans who they looked on as barbarians. And if you study second semester world history, you'll eventually learn, hopefully learn, that it was the Europeans who wound up coming in and taking over much of China and making havoc of China. That was in the 1800s. But during this period of time, the Chinese thought that they sat on top of the world. Anyway, the Silk Road was still in operation, but going mostly to the Middle East. They used their big ships. Now, village life, the Chinese, during this time, considered you part of a family if you were descended from the same great-great-grandparents. That meant when you were born, you would be living not in the same house with your cousin, but in the same neighborhood with all your first cousins, second cousins, and third cousins, and so on. All of you closely related. And this was necessary because of the rice growing they did. The main crop was rice, but it took a community effort to farm the rice. So you would be part of a family. You'd probably have lived in a village. Most of them did. And if you had any part in the government, it would be through the village. Women. Women were considered inferior in China, and this was true of most of your civilizations in the ancient world. Male superiority was the norm. Concubines did have a few. The concubine was a rich person's lesser wife. I mean, the rich people would have the main wife, and then they have a harem of lesser wives called concubines. They had a few privileges. Domestic servants, even fewer. Now, something else, too, about the women. They were considered so important that in times of famine, oftentimes female babies were killed. Now, a lot of folks will have said history repeats itself. The idea of killing your female babies did not confine itself to the 11, 12, 13, and 1400s. It was repeated again in the 20th century. When the Chinese government, to try to curb its population, made a law that parents were only to be limited to 2 children, so to carry on the family name, Chinese couples would kill their female babies, and somehow didn't realize without female babies they weren't going to have children anyway. Have any of you heard this from outside? I mean, several heads are nodding. You've heard this already. And they wound up that when these young men, Chinese men, grew up, they could not find wives because the few women who had been born were already taken, and the Chinese men greatly outnumbered the Chinese women. But in this time period we're talking about, Chinese girls were killed so that their father was not to feed them. Or in time of hardship, Chinese girls were often sold. I mean, the fathers would sell their daughters as sex slaves or as domestic servants or as concubines or even as prostitutes. Anyway, at all that the family could get money out of the services of these women. Now, there was another practice that began about this time, the practice of foot binding. Foot binding is where that they take a girl from infancy, from the time she was born, and wrap her feet in a bind that was so tight that her feet never grew any bigger than what it had as an infant. Now, you might say, what was the purpose of this? Simply, it was to deform their legs, to make them look more attractive to their men, and also to make the women, to guarantee the women to be subservient. Now, this practice was not done as much in southern China because the southern Chinese needed the women to work the rice fields, so a crippled woman could not work the rice field. Now, I had an American boy in another school about 3 years ago say, I don't find crippled women attractive. And I said, well, being an American you wouldn't, but if you had grown up in China at this time, you would expect the women to have had their feet bound. And when this practice began to be outlawed, folks, this may surprise you, it was not the men who objected to it, it was the women. The older women said, hey, young girls' feet ought to be bound. The practice of foot binding was, they tried to outlaw it in the 1890s when China had a female empress. She tried to outlaw, but it was finally outlawed by the communists in 1950, 1 year after communists took over. But your authors say that they went to China in the 1980s and saw some women who still had bound feet. When the Chinese communists outlawed foot binding, some people in the countryside either ignored the law or did not know about the law and continued to practice anyway. Today, though, there are very few Chinese women left who have had their feet bound. Again, they thought it was attractive. The nearest thing we have to it in the West is the practice of women wearing high-heeled shoes. Now, I see less of that, but now when I was younger, a lot of the girls wore high heels, and it was true that more than 90% of American women in the 1960s had problems with their feet, problems with fallen arches, horns, bunions, ingrown toenails, and plantar warts. I don't know if any of you have had any of these problems or not, but I mean, ingrown toenails are not always caused by improperly fitting shoes, but anyway, these problems still go on, but not to the extent that they once did. Again, I once asked my mother, why do women wear high-heeled shoes? She said it was to make them look better, make them look more attractive. My mother wore them herself. Most of my sisters do not take it up, and the younger, as far as I know, my nephews and nieces rarely wear them. My 2 daughters have worn high heels, but they almost never. Occasionally, on rare occasions, they wear them, but not even to church, not even when they dressed up. Rarely ever did they wear them. But again, the high heels is like the nearest thing we in the West have to the practice of foot binding. Yeah, your book, Martha's mentioned, they saw women as late as the 1980s, still with it. I mean, I'm probably older than your authors. I saw pictures of it. I mean, when I was a kid, 1950s, 1960s, the people who had been to China would come back and show pictures of women who had had their feet bound. Okay, I'm going to back to political history. Of all the world's conquerors, there are only two of them who can be said to have really started from poverty. I mean, Alexander the Great was the son of the most powerful man in this part of the world. You can say Julius Caesar was a member of Rome's upper classes. But the two of them I'm thinking about is Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. I mentioned Tamerlane. Sometimes I call Tamerlane. Now, there are persons who say that Tamerlane is a descendant of Genghis Khan on his mother's side, but this cannot actually be proven. You have a chronicler who says that, but Tamerlane was started out fairly well impoverished. But the most impoverished of all of the conquerors was Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the son of a Mongolian nobleman, but a nobleman of small rank. And when Genghis Khan was 10 years old, his father was poisoned. Well, Genghis Khan's tribe deserted him, and Genghis, being the oldest son, was supposed to have taken over. Instead, all the male members of the tribe left, so Genghis Khan led around a bunch of women for about 7 or 8 years. Then, when he grew up, he got a following. He was able to unite himself. This is a complex story, but he was able to unite himself with some another Mongolian tribe. During his growing up, his boyhood, the Mongolians were a bunch of loose tribal people with no nation, no central authority, and they spent their time wandering around and fighting among themselves. Well, Genghis Khan conquered first one tribe, then conquered another, then conquered another. And within about 10 years, he had united all the Mongolians. He effectively organized his army by putting his troops in squads of 10 and told each troop, if you ever leave your squad of 10 during a battle, you'll be executed. You must always stay with your squad of 10. And this way, the enemy found that they could never engage a single Mongolian. They had to engage the whole squad. If they engaged anyone, the whole squad would come after them. Now, when Genghis Khan had conquered Mongolia, some of his subjects urged him, hey, go down and conquer China. We've been to China, we've seen China. The Chinese army is weak and ineffective, and the leadership of the army is very bad. Genghis Khan did hesitate, knowing that China probably had millions of people. He only had an army of 100,000 men, but he finally got motivated to go. He went to the Great Wall of China, which stopped him temporarily. And the Chinese were terrified, so they shored up their defenses along the wall. But then Genghis Khan and men just marched around back and forth along the wall. And finally the Chinese became complacent. Genghis Khan noticed one time when he got to a gate that there was hardly anybody guarding the gate, so he got his men with a battering ram and they knocked down the gate, and Genghis Khan was inside. Once inside, again the Chinese military was totally ineffective. The emperor fled. One of the generals drank poison and committed suicide rather than face him. The whole thing just fell apart. Genghis Khan conquered most of northern China. Then he was stopped, again for the same reason the Muslims stopped. His army was mostly all cavalry, horsemen. And they did not fight very well in the rice paddies of this region here. So the southern part of China was able to hold off the Mongolians for a while, but not for indefinitely. Now, I want to say this. Later on, when the Mongolian dynasty tried to conquer Vietnam, the Vietnamese drove them out because, again, the Mongolians' way of fighting just simply did not work, fighting in the Vietnamese jungles. The Vietnamese drove them out using guerrilla warfare. And to think, we're going to come to this in the next chapter, Vietnam was to defeat the United States the same way, using guerrilla warfare. But anyway, the Mongolians then went across the Himalayan mountains and went into this part of the Muslim world and wreaked havoc to this part of the world. Genghis Khan enjoyed killing folk, much like Tamerlane, who came later. Genghis Khan, but again, your book says he, unlike Tamerlane, Genghis Khan would kill maybe to open up trade routes or for economic reasons. Tamerlane killed for no reason, and just for the sheer fun of killing. Genghis Khan's army, detachment went up here and conquered Russia, and they were to hold Russia for 200 years. This became very important because it said that the Russians could never determine whether their destiny was toward the east or west. Now, I had a student from Russia in my class about the year 2001 when I first started teaching here. He asked me, hey, what was Russia? What were they doing during the time of I said, Russia made 3 big contributions to humanity. And I said, I mean all this as a compliment. Number 1, they defeated Hitler. Number 2, they defeated Napoleon. Again, that's another. But number 3, they served as a buffer between Mongolia and the rest of Europe. And that helped keep the Mongolians out of Europe. Now, once the Mongolians had conquered Russia, they were ready to swoop into Europe, and nobody knows what would happen. Europe was divided. Maybe the European armored knights could have kept them at bay. Whatever happened, Genghis Khan died, and all these Mongolians went back to Mongolia. They did keep Russia, held it for 200 years, but they never did mount another offensive. And by the time the Mongolians got together enough to mount an offensive, Europe had better cannon and better weaponry and better equipment, and the Mongolians were no longer able to burst out. Now, I've mentioned how that the Mongolians have burst out of Mongolia several times in history. The Huns were from Mongolia, the Bulgars, the Magyars, the Turks. Genghis Khan was the last wave of Mongolians to burst out of Mongolia and start overspreading this part of the globe. After that, this part of the world got better weaponry, and the Mongolians were somewhat left behind. Actually, greatly left behind. If you compare the size of empires, Genghis Khan's may have been the largest, at least in name, and included all of what is today the northern part of China, Mongolia, and Siberia, all the way up to the Arctic Ocean, and this area here, and all of Russia. In name, he had all that. In actual reality, he might not have had as much control over it as he would have liked to have. Genghis Khan was buried. The people who buried him were all executed. To this day, Genghis Khan's tomb has never been seen by anyone, never been found. We don't even have hardly a vague idea of anymore where he was buried. Anyway, to me, Genghis Khan is what happens to a dynasty that wants to devote itself to nothing more than peace and prosperity and helping the poor. All these sound like great and noble objectives. And you might ask, well, what's wrong with them? Simply this: if you overexpend yourself on helping the poor, you wind up being conquered. Just if you go back to Roman times, ask the Romans. They fed the poor among themselves, so the poor became idle and useless, and the barbarians overtook the Romans. The Chinese under the Song tried it, and a bunch of barbarians came in and overtook and overpowered them. And of course, most of you feel like that can't happen in the United States. Time will tell. Anyway, Genghis Khan founded the Yuan dynasty. As I've mentioned, it's the Mongolian dynasty, and his most famous descendant was Kublai Khan. Now, eventually, the Mongolians were to be overcome by the Ming dynasty. But to me, the Ming dynasty is more a subject of second semester. Just know that they were there, but I'm not going to. They were to govern China for hundreds of years after they overthrew the Mongolians. All right, which takes us up then to In Search of the Way. Well, now your book goes into why that the Chinese stopped going to other places. Again, it's because they felt like these trips were expensive, and they quit going to California, quit going to, I mean, the folk, again, my own take on it is when you quit expanding, you contract. It's either expand and advance or contract. The Chinese decided it's too expensive to expand, so we're going to, without meaning to, they contracted. Now, the way. In the Chinese language, the term the way means the Da, the path that you should follow, religion. The story I'm about to tell is a story about the conflict between religion and philosophy, or conflict between religions and between philosophy. Essentially, what happened during the era of 6 dynasties, Confucianism was threatened by the more spiritual Buddhism and Taoism. And a lot of Chinese were somewhat upset, particularly at Buddhism, because it was considered a foreign religion, and China prided itself on we don't accept foreign religions. And I'm going to insert something here that's not in the book. It is believed that Christianity found its way to China as early as 100 AD or 100 CE, if one be politically correct about it. And waves of Christian missionaries came to China and Mongolia, but they made very few converts, owing to the fact that Chinese consider themselves better than foreigners and better than, in their religion, better than any foreign religion. Not only that religion of their own people was worth having. Now, ironically, in the year 1949, China was taken over by a foreign religion. I'm calling it, well, call it a philosophy. China was taken over by a foreign philosophy, namely communism. But they wouldn't accept Christianity, but they got communism instead. But anyway, they had struggles during this time we're talking about between Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. And it reminds me of struggles that the people of India had between Hinduism on one hand and Buddhism on the other. And in the case of both India and China, the main religion had to compromise to get its people back. Same with China. China developed a new philosophy called Neo-Confucianism. Oops. Neo-Confucianism was an attempt to reconcile Buddha with Confucius, but there are some competing ideologies simply will not reconcile. Now, in the long run, I'm going to jump ahead. Neo-Confucianism never became the official religion of China, probably because it was too much like Buddhism. And the Chinese eventually rejected Buddhism. Ultimately, they went back to Confucianism. Now, Buddhism, though, made some adaptations. Your book calls the signification of Buddhism. They made some adaptations to try to get the Chinese people, and did get a lot of them. Now, you had 2 philosophers who came on the scene at this time. And in fact, your Chinese have 4 main philosophers. The first one being Confucius, the second being Mencius, and a third one being Chu Ci. Do what I'm going to just take this. You've all seen this, I guess. He was philosopher number 3, and his opponent was Wang Yangming. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing these pronouncing these names right. But anyway, Chu Ci, that's by the way spelled Z-H-U, but pronounced C-H-U. He believed that every one of us had within ourselves 2 opposing forces. You might call them light and dark, which reminds you of the yin and the yang, but he had different words for them. Basically, one force was to try to lead us to good. It was the morally upright one. and it was connected to the Chinese supreme God. And this was a part of us that influenced us to do morally right. Then there was another part of us that was pushing us to do morally wrong. I mean, it reminds you somewhat of Sigmund Freud, if the ego, the id, superego, if you study psychology. But these forces, one of them would never triumph over the other, but at times one would be above the other, then the other would rise above the one. It was our duty to try to keep the good force at the top of our, you might say, our soul or psyche, and the bad force out. The main thing, though, I mean, all right, yes, according to your book, human beings were at a crossroad between heaven on the one hand and earth on the other, and we were in the middle. And our goal was to try to get ourselves heavenward and weaned away from earth. And the way to do that was to, well, in a case, both of these men believe by meditation. Proper meditation would get our minds on heavenly things and get us geared towards heaven and away from earth. Now, he was opposed, though, by Wang Yangming. Yang Wangming believed that the main thing was action. Never mind knowledge. And knowledge is not knowledge without action, and action does not exist without knowledge. You act upon what you know, or you know upon what you act, but without action there's no knowledge, without knowledge there's no action. Before this, the Chinese had believed, well, you had to figure out what you're going to do before you do it. He said, no, you figure out what you're doing as you do it, not before. I'd hate to hire a mechanic to work my car who tried to figure out how my car works as he's working on it. I mean, you know, hopefully he knows how the car works before he learns about it before he starts to work on it. But anyway, some of these philosophies, folks, you transpose them to the 21st century, they appear to be, and I'll have to say about Socrates and Plato, they appear to be somewhat benign, somewhat asinine. Use a word that you all understand, somewhat idiotic, but quite frankly. But nevertheless, these were the philosophies that shaped Chinese thought and culture.
I mean, it kind of makes sense.
What's that?
It kind of makes sense. I mean, because how are you supposed to learn through their doing? I mean,
To some extent, that's true.
yeah.
But when a mechanic is learning about your car, hopefully he's learning by doing, but he's learning from someone who already has done. I mean, yeah, hopefully before he works on your car, he has done it before.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you're not learn, well, you know, I've never seen your car before, but I'm going to attempt to take it apart and fix what's wrong with it. But I don't know how it works, but I don't know why it's not working now. But I'll figure it out once I get inside it. Now, folks, I've been there many a time. I've done that myself. But I quit working on my car many years ago, and I want to say this. When I was a kid, young boys would take old hot rods and try to soup them up. You can't do that in today's cars. You know what I mean? Soup them up, increase performance, then get out in the drag strip and race them. We've got oftentimes get on the street and race them, and sometimes have fatal accidents. Today, I don't think that's a popular pastime among young boys because today's cars simply cannot be souped up.
Well, you can zoom up, but it takes like extreme engineering and.
Well, okay, it can be done.
It's hard.
But it's not like it was when I was, where you could go to the junkyard, pick up a carburetor, 4-barrel carburetor from a junkyard.
Yeah, you can't
So
just-
you can't do it that way. No, it's much harder. But anyway, Yang Wangming believed that each person was born knowing right from wrong. And you don't have to be taught right from wrong. You know what's right and wrong. Folks, I'm in no way espousing this philosophy, but I have to teach because this man believed it was a big part of what made China what it is. And I think a big part of what sent China tumbling downward, the same way that the Greek world came tumbling downward as a result of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. I mean, folks, I find philosophy fascinating. And yet, most of the time, your philosophers left the world far worse off than the world would have been if they never come on the scene. In Christian theology, the Apostle Paul had nothing good to say about philosophy. I'll put it to you this way. But anyway, he believed that persons were innately good. And he also believed, and a lot of this borders on existentialism, that existence precedes essence. In other words, it's not the world that creates our mind, but our mind creates the world that we live in. So our mind, the most important part of our existence is our mind. Again, I'm not espousing this, so hopefully you understand. But the most important part of our existence is our mind, and in our mind we create our own world, which exists out there. It's not the other way around, where the world shapes us and forms us. No, we form it, and we shape the world with our mind. The mind then is a source of all reason. We all have an inner light and an inner moral goodness. The way to bring out that goodness and make us better persons morally is through meditation. Very similar to Buddhist. Now, these men were Neo-Confucian, and both of these men have been elevated in recent times. I want to say this about both of them also. They passed government tests and got a government job. But they were kicked out of one government job after another and wound up unemployed and broke. And only after they died were they highly honored, which is typical of so many of your prophets, so many of your sages, so many of your wise men, and typical of Confucius, Socrates. They were not honored until after they were gone. Now, which brings us to the next point. Why did China not excel? While the Chinese were interested in developing moral philosophy, in meditation, in introspection, all the way across the vast continent of Eurasia, Europeans were doing things like becoming merchants, developing the mechanical clock. And folk, you may know this about the mechanical clock. The minute hand has to have a gear that's 60-to-1 ratio to the hour gear. And then the second gear is a 61-to-1 ratio to the minute gear. That way the second hand goes around 60 times before the minute. The second hand goes all the way around once before the minute hand moves 1/60 the way across. So on basically have to have gears. The gears that the Europeans made were to lead to the invention of the automobile. And if you try to make a gear out of wood or out of steel and form it, you'll find that you can't do it unless you have a special skill. But what happens is that the gear has to be perfectly round to work, or near perfectly round, and all the teeth have to be the same size. So you get one. If you're not careful, the last tooth will not fit. Any of you tried it? Maybe you haven't tried it, but you know what I mean. I have. It was a disaster. But all the teeth in the gear, and then the gear joining it, it has to also be round, and its teeth have to all be the same size. Well, Europeans were learning how to do this. Europeans, the first mechanical invention was the mechanical clock, but it was to lead the invention of the train, the automobile, and eventually the airplane. Make long story short, folks, China was up here while Europe was down here. Fast forward a few hundred years, Europe forged ahead and left China behind. Again, what was the reason? Well, most historians today blame the Chinese philosophers, but there are several things that went on. Number one is the Chinese despised industry and craftsmen and traders. And this was a mistake. They looked on farming as being the number one profession. Now, I can tell you something about farming in this country. When I was a kid growing up in a small country town, West Middletown, Ohio, and we'd play other schools, they looked on us as being poor farm boys. Farmers were looked down on as being poor. Likely, of the 20-some thousand students or more who are going to this school, not one of you plans to be a farmer. And we have a real problem in this country now. All the farmers are getting old, and their sons and daughters are not taking up the interest in their farm, and nobody knows who's going to run the farms when you're gone. And, oh, we need them. We need farmers. Somebody who fails as a plumber or fails as somebody decide to take up the farm at some point. farming is looked down on in our country and has been for hundreds of years, looked down on as being less of a profession to go into. Less in engineering, less about. In China, farming was the number one, and merchants and traders were looked on as being greedy and filthy and whatever else. Also, the fact that China was united. Of all the peoples we've studied, India was not united. The Muslim world was only united for a short time. If China had been divided into 50 countries, perhaps one of them might have found what they were looking for, the right way, the way to technology, the way to inventiveness. As it was, China was united so the emperor could move in and stop technological progress in its tracks. In Europe, you had anywhere from 100 to 200 countries at one time. It varied from generation to generation. And one or two of them found a way. Some of the German states did, Great Britain did. They started inventing, making things. Again, disunited. So sometimes it helps to be disunited instead of united. Also, Chinese young men were told to, the only way they could excel was through the civil service exam. And then the only way to excel was through a government position. Well, in our country today, if you don't want to serve in government, you can excel being an army officer, you can excel being an athlete or an engineer, a scientist, an entrepreneur, industrialist. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to excel. And most of them do not have anything at all to do with government. But in China, they didn't care anything about entrepreneurs or industrialists, just become a government official. All right. So basically, to make long story short, Chinese family, there's one thing I must mention before we close, civil service exam. The civil service exam appears to have been an invention of the Chinese, where they realized that, hey, just because a man's father held a job doesn't mean the son is going to be qualified. So the civil exam, in an attempt to try to determine by a test score whether a person could qualify for a government job. And of course, I had a student ask, how do you know that a high test score guarantees you make a good government official? Oh, quite frankly, it doesn't. In fact, in a lot of cases, the higher you do in college, the less likely you are to be a good government official. But that's another issue. But anyway, now here is a problem with the civil service exam. Number one, only the rich could get educated, so the poor had no chance of passing them. But here is something that folk, it's been about 8 years ago, someone reported me for saying this. I'm going to say it anyway. I always repeat it. The civil service exams in China were slanted toward Confucianism. That much is in the book. Now here's how, fast forward to 21st century America, our American tests on a higher level are slanted towards liberalism and leftism. I've discussed with fellow faculty and they tend to agree with me. If you don't like it, tell me now. You can go to higher up if you want to, but my boss has told me we can say anything we want to. You know, I try to be careful what I say. If I step on toes, spoke, I really believe I'm supposed to. That's what teachers call it for, to pry open, closed, complacent minds. Yes, our exams, and also your book mentions there was cheating on the exams. Morality has not improved one bit. Cheating on tests has made huge news across the country here of late. Big news. But your book mentions there was cheating. Oh yes, one other thing, then I'll close. Only men were allowed to take the exams. Women were not allowed. Women generally were not educated and did not know how to read. All right.